Hello. Let's talk about sex. How many of you have ever had a sexual or romantic experience? How many of you do that pretty frequently? Some of you might be, but how frequently can you talk about it? And how many of you can talk about it anytime, anywhere, with anyone? So what I wanted to do in this video was both challenge myself, because I rarely mention this in all of my Facebook Lives with you, but to help all of us come into having more natural conversation around something that our bodies naturally do, around something that's regularly a part of our lives. While we don't necessarily have to talk about it all the time, how do we make it something that we are completely comfortable talking about? The more and more that you shift everything natural that's happening in your life to be something comfortable, something without judgments, without predispositions, how much easier will you be to feel this great sense of joy, like all of your cells are alive because you are fully being yourself. That sense of relaxation and contentment and expansion and creativity, all those things that come with being who we are and being okay with that. Now, many of us have had religious or spiritual beliefs that have led us to feeling like sex is a bad thing. We have the forbidden fruit. I will say this to some of you listening right now, that if you do have religious or spiritual beliefs that sex is bad, and you're happy with those beliefs, then you may just want to turn this video off right now, because you might not like some of the things that I'm going to share in this video. I myself, living in a spiritual community for almost 7 years, had a lot of healing to do with my relationship with sex, because I really started to think that it was a bad thing. And there I was in relationships doing this dance of wanting this type of connection, but then thinking that it's bad and going back and forth. And how many of you ever have this dance inside of you? In one way you think something is good, another way that you think something is bad, and how stressful that can feel when you go back and forth between them. But how wonderful it could feel for you if you find the common ground, the way to assimilate, the way to be able to make a decision and move that forward. So it's part of what we're doing here. Now, some of you have also had some bad experiences with sexuality. Right now we have the Me Too movement happening. Yet sexuality doesn't just exist with another person. It also exists within our own selves. And we want to be able to dissociate anything from anything past negative to do with sexuality, so that we can be with that thing that exists in ourselves. And once again, like I mentioned, so that you can feel good about yourself and comfortable with yourself, so that you can access all sides of your own self. And what I wanted to do to help us feel more comfortable with this sense of sexuality and this thing that's part of yourselves is just sharing a couple funny stories first with you about some experiences with this for myself. And then I'll also share 3 points which will help give you some wisdom and some ideas as to how to create that sense of comfort in yourself, to be fully aligned with all those different aspects of yourself. Now, remember, I mentioned I was living in a spiritual community for almost 7 years. Much of that time, I was in some ways trying to be what you may call a nun. I was actually completely staying away from those experiences. And also, I was gathering this perception that sex and sexuality is a bad thing. I had performed a dance early on for one of the communities, And I was told by the leader before I moved to the more isolated community that if I was going to do any dance performing at all, I needed to make sure that somebody looked over the entire dance, because the way I moved was just too sexual, too much in the hips and the lower chakras. So I did have my dances looked over with scrutiny before I performed them in that community. And I think they passed, they met the mark for what needed to happen there. So here I am living with this ideology. And then I go to town just about 30 minutes away. There's a very different type of atmosphere and energy and personality in town. There I am in town at an astrology class. And this teacher was going through some of the students' charts, and he put it on the big screen in front of us so we could all see it, so we could have a live example and he could explain things. He put my chart up there. And as he's going through, he's pointing out, now you see this points to this and this points to that, and oh, you must be really sexual, aren't you? He looks at me and exclaims. Every single person in the room just turns their head and looks right at me. That was one of my embarrassing moments. How many of you have had embarrassing moments before? Yeah, we all have them. And that was one of them. Because I had this judgment that sexuality was bad. And it was like, oh no, don't let the secret out. Nobody's allowed to know that there's a lot of sexual energy that exists in me. But how many of us are truly able to hide who we are? So here's the other funny story that I had. This was actually one of the deepest spiritual experiences that I had ever had. I want you to think about one of your deepest spiritual experiences while I share this story so you can get into the feeling and the essence of this. This is performing an acted out creche scene. The creche scene is at Christmas time, and that's where people hold still and they play the characters of Mary and the baby Jesus, and maybe they even are the lamb and they're the angels and the three kings that are coming. We would actually act it out at the community. This performance was so popular that it wasn't just the entire community that came from the spiritual community, but also the neighbors would come. There's about 300 people crammed in a space that doesn't really seat 300 people. So people had to stand around the edges of this room. And everyone's just intensely waiting for one of their deepest spiritual times of the year, for this amazing performance. I was Mary in this performance. I had this experience of going backwards and forwards in time, of literally feeling like I was Mary, because so many people in the room intensely wanted me to be Mary so that they could feel that in that moment. And I was Mary in the past looking at what happens in the future. And I was me in the present looking at Mary in the past. All of this play was going on, and I think I wrote a whole book after that one evening of experience of all the things that I learned and felt from that. So here I am acting out this experience of playing Mary in the creche scene, and there comes the line from the angel when I find out that I'm going to be bearing a son. There's going to be this great being, but I haven't actually had sex with anyone. You know, so I'm wondering how in the world this is happening, but there it is, this angel is telling me. And I look up to him, and my line, I say this, but I am a virgin. And remember, this is a very serious experience, but everyone in the room started exploding with laughter while I'm sharing this very deep moment. And I felt like my acting was phenomenal. The energy was so thick that the muscles were shaking and I could barely even speak my lines. But there I said that line, and nobody believed me that I was a virgin. That's how much sometimes our true self is still there, right? How many times can you really truly hide who you are and what you really feel? Even when you hide it from others, you can't hide it from yourself. It just comes out. There were 3 things that happened on my recent trip to Bali that I wanted to share with you because they brought another understanding to this idea of sexuality and how we can get more comfortable with it. However we choose to access it and choose to process it and choose to live it in our lives, to know that you can have choice with that. So there's actually no requirements to what sexuality is and how much you do it. Some people say you should have sex all the time, and others say you shouldn't have sex at all. There can be this space there where you get to decide what's right for you. And the first reason why I'm going to say that is because having sex is really just an energy. It's sexual energy. I mentioned the chakras earlier. These are the energy centers throughout the center of our spine. The chakra that it's associated with is the second chakra. Now, the chakras all, in a way, they communicate and they can move energy between them. So if you have this sexual energy in the second chakra, sexual energy is not just something that translates to sex. It translates to immunity, to the health of your body. So in India, when I was studying one-on-one with an Ayurvedic doctor, he used to say, you know, if you're this age, you can have sex this much, and then once you get over this age, you can only have sex this much. And he actually coined it out because as our immunity weakens, or as it gets harder for us to exist in our physical body, as it gets more challenged, then if we're putting energy into the sexuality, it's harder for the immunity to take care of itself in your body. I'm not going to say whether or not I believe that or whether or not all of that is true, but just the fact that sexual energy goes towards immunity, not just sex. Another thing that sexual energy goes to is creativity. How many of you are creative or know people are creative? You may also notice that people who are creative might seem to be very sexual. And it doesn't mean that they're sexual like having sex, but remember, it's that energy, that sexual energy that goes to multiple things. So that's something to keep in mind, that the act of sex is just a way of processing that energy, but it can be processed in many forms in many ways. That's another reason why I say you can choose. I think it's okay if you never have sex your whole life and you feel absolutely calm inside and you're using that energy in other ways. Number 2, the second thing that happened in Bali that I wanted to share with you, which was going through a course that was actually on the sacred women and spirituality and dance all combined together. And one of the things that the teacher mentioned was that sexuality came before sex. That having that movement and having that feeling in our body was already natural and innate to who we are before we made it into a physical action. Once we made it into a physical action, we made all these judgments about that physical action. But this was already something natural to ourselves. So why make such a fuss over it when it's something that's already there? One of the things that she described was while her marriage was getting worse, her relationship with sexuality was getting better. Because it's something that you can have with your own self. And how great would it be for you if you could be fully embodied in all the aspects of you, who you are, and be able to grow in all the aspects of who you are without even needing to have another person involved. How wonderful to be able to fully enjoy your own self. What's there? And then you could share that with someone else or not, whatever you want to do. And I'm not just talking about having an orgasm, but I'm talking about that second chakra energy of feeling it and allowing it to move through your body and access all the different sides of it. Now, you don't have to spend your time, right, in the second chakra, but you can. That's one of the many chakras in our body. One of the interviews in my book, this is a yoga therapist, and she does a lot of work with people who've been practicing yoga and spiritual practices, and they often want to focus on the upper chakras. But here they have a problem in their physical body, and the physical body is a little more associated with the lower chakras, so she has to take them to those lower chakras. I don't think it is bad, because the physical is only a manifestation of the spiritual. You can listen to Abraham Hicks to hear one of these talks. I've talked about this as well. So again, lower chakras, just a physical manifestation of the spiritual, another form that the energy exists in. Number 3, where do we get this benefit of allowing ourselves to be fully who we are by not having judgments? How many of you have experienced judgments and the crash that brings on your world in a certain way? It's like naturally feeling as if you want to go in a certain direction, but there's judgments, and then you start to question, and going back to you having these two different battling sides that are happening within you. But one of the conversations that I had with this teacher, she was explaining that part of how she came up with this understanding of sexuality was because she had a lot of bad experiences when she was younger. And she was more promiscuous than she should have been, and in ways that were not very good. And I said to her, you know, I was the same way when I was younger. I don't know how she tapped into this, but then she looked at me and she said, but did you enjoy those experiences? And I said, yes, I did. Actually, it felt kind of empowering and expansive. Now, I had experiences, I mentioned the spiritual community, but another thing that had happened that had formed that judgment in myself, I was on a trip with my mother. It was a family reunion. So we had a whole bunch of people visiting. I met a guy who seemed kind of interesting, so in the evening when the family stuff was done, I spent a little time hanging out with him. Drinking water is always good for you. We were hanging out, and it was a little late when I came back, and my mother gave me a lecture in the morning. And she didn't want anyone to know that I was hanging out with a guy. She said, you know, I don't want people to think that you're just one of these other girls that was brought up without a dad, and so you're really promiscuous and all that stuff. So there I get planted in my head, being promiscuous, being very sexual. It's a bad thing. But then I'm sitting with this woman, and she asked me, but did you enjoy those experiences? And yes, there were some experiences where I wasn't treated that well or didn't enjoy them, but I just didn't carry on with that person anymore, and that experience was done. So I'm saying this again for you to think about, where are there judgments in your life, not just with sexuality, but in other areas of life? But then ask yourself, is that something that I actually enjoy? Is that something that I feel good when I do it? If I didn't have any of those judgments, would I feel good about doing that? So that's my challenge for you, to help you live more in who you are. And that helps you feel more contentment, more relaxation, more energy, and more joy by just being fully aligned with your own self. And back to the topic of sex, I put in here, let's talk about sex. Because how often do we talk about it publicly? So now you get the opportunity. You don't have to go forward and do this, but I challenge you to talk about it more, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever it might be, all those layers of that, so that you can continue to go into your full, expressed, and relaxed self. And Michael, you just posted something here. The movement of Kundalini energy and sexual energy in your body is orgasm. Orgasm is way more than just climax. climax is just one stop on the cycle of orgasm. And there are many subtleties of orgasm to experience than just the goal of climax. Beautiful. Yes. The term orgasm can be expanded, absolutely, for all the many experiences that happen in our bodies. And some of us, like I mentioned, are going to want to go into feeling all the different layers of that. Some of us are going to channel that energy to taking care of the health of our body. Some of us are going to channel it to creativity. Whatever direction it may go, I bless you in all of those areas. And I hope that you continue to enjoy the full self that you are, because you are beautiful. Thanks so much for tuning in.